The first thing Admiral Cale Morrow noticed when the Calyx threshold station materialized on the long-range display was how perfectly it sat at the junction of three sovereign corridors. Not hidden, not fortified in the way empires fortified things they feared losing. Positioned. Like a piece on a board that had been placed 6 moves ahead of the game everyone else thought they were playing. "Emergence complete," her navigation officer reported. "All 14 vessels holding formation. Station Calyx threshold bearing 037 relative, range 400,000 kilometers. They've painted us with active sensors." Morrow said nothing. She stood at the center of the INS Hearthstone's command bridge, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the wraparound display populate with data. 14 ships of the Terran Interdiction Group, 7 destroyers, 4 cruisers, 2 fleet tenders, and the Hearthstone herself, a sovereign-class battlecruiser displacing 11 million metric tons. Not the largest force humanity had ever deployed. Not even close. But size, Morrow had learned across 4 decades of service, was only one dialect of the language that mattered out here. The language that mattered was position. "Signal from the station," her communications officer said. "Standard Combine greeting protocol. They're welcoming us to the threshold and requesting we hold at the demarcation perimeter." "Acknowledge the greeting, hold position as requested." Morrow tilted her chin toward the tactical display. "What's parked there?" Commander Lyon Vassic, her chief of staff, expanded the sensor overlay. Icons bloomed across the display like a field of cold stars. 86 vessels in the inner perimeter. 42 flagged as Vethanar Combine Naval, the rest commercial or diplomatic. 3 orbital construction platforms. And 1 deep space communications relay, big one, cross-sector capable. He paused. Also reading 11 warships from the Kesari packed in a holding pattern on the far side. Morrow's eyes moved to those 11 icons. Kesari. The machine logic polity that had spent 1100 years building an empire on calculation, arbitration, and the absolute conviction that every conflict was a solvable equation. They didn't wage wars. They didn't need to. They solved species the way an engineer solves a tolerance problem, by reducing everything that didn't fit to parameters that did. Their fleets didn't conquer territory. They arbitrated it. Their weapons didn't threaten, they enforced optimal outcomes. In 1100 years, the Kesari had absorbed 19 sovereign polities, and not one of them could point to the moment when absorption had been chosen over coexistence. The model simply showed that absorption was better. The model was always correct. The absorbed polity's own analysts confirmed it. That was the trick. That was the whole trick. "The Kesari are early," Morrow said. "By 6 hours, Admiral. Their senior arbiter, Overmind Tessek 4, transmitted a courtesy notice to the Combine an hour before we emerged. Standard positioning statement. They want us to know they arrived first." Morrow allowed herself the smallest expression that might have been a smile. Standard. There was nothing standard about what was happening at Calyx threshold. 31 days ago, the Vethanar Combine had transmitted a formal diplomatic summons across 48 sovereign corridors simultaneously, an unprecedented act of political theater. The summons convened what the Combine called a convergence of settled law, invoking treaty architecture that hadn't been activated in 900 years. At the center of it, a resolution drafted by the Kesari Pact, co-sponsored by 11 other polities, formally reclassifying human military assets as Category 9 destabilizing instruments and requiring their phased disarmament under multilateral supervision. The resolution didn't mention Earth by name. It didn't need to. There was only one species in the galactic record whose warships triggered the Category 9 threshold. Every scanning station in 3 sectors had filed the same assessment. No species in the cataloged archive maintained a fleet-to-population ratio that deviated from the galactic mean by a factor exceeding 4. Humanity's deviation factor was 14.7. "I want full passive sensor coverage on every Kesari hull," Morrow said. Weapons signatures, power plant cycling, communication burst patterns. Log everything, share nothing. Aye, Admiral. The Hearthstone drifted forward at station-keeping thrust, her hull a dark slab of weathered alloy against the amber glow of the Threshold's orbital halo. She was not a beautiful ship. Her lines were blunt, practical, scarred from 2 refits, and a decade of deep patrol service that had left her plating mismatched, and her forward sensor arrays slightly asymmetrical, where a replacement module hadn't quite matched the original housing. Scorch marks from last year's live-fire exercises still discolored the port bow. 3 hull panels forward of the bridge had been replaced with newer alloy that hadn't yet oxidized to match the rest, giving the Hearthstone the look of a vessel that had been maintained by hands that cared about function, not appearance. But her silhouette was unmistakable, the wide, flat prow of a sovereign class, the stacked engine nacelles running her full length like a spine, the recessed weapons bays that gave her profile a sense of compressed weight, as though the ship were holding something back. She was. Morrow knew every system aboard by memory, the 32 missile batteries in the forward magazines, the 8 particle lance arrays buried in the ventral hull, the classified countermeasure suite that had no official designation in any fleet document. She also knew which systems were not in any file the Kesari had ever accessed. Admiral, Vasek stepped closer, lowering his voice. We've received a private channel request from Ambassador Drevin. She's aboard the diplomatic tender Quiet Meridian, docked at the station's east arm. She's asking for a face-to-face before the session opens. Ambassador Senna Drevin, Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Outer Compact. The woman who had spent 9 years building relationships across 14 species states, and who, according to the last intelligence brief Morrow had read, believed the disarmament resolution could be defeated through procedural challenge alone. Tell the ambassador I'll meet her in 2 hours, Morrow said. After I've finished reading the room. She specified urgency, Admiral. I heard you, Morrow turned back to the display. 2 hours. Vasek didn't argue. He'd served under Morrow long enough to recognize the specific quality of her stillness, not indecision, not arrogance. Assessment. The Admiral was watching the board the way she always watched boards, counting pieces, measuring distances, calculating which moves had already been made before she'd arrived. Morrow studied the Kesari formation. 11 warships, but that word was generous. The Kesari didn't build warships the way most species did. They built arbitration platforms, vessels optimized for sensor coverage, communication dominance, and the projection of what the Kesari called logical inevitability. Each ship carried enough firepower to slag a continent, but the weapons were secondary. The real threat was the network, the 11 ships linked into a single distributed intelligence, sharing processing, sharing perception, sharing the cold mathematical certainty that whatever they decided was, by definition, the optimal outcome. Each platform measured roughly 3 kilometers stem to stern, their hulls a pale ceramic composite that reflected light in a way that made them look almost organic, like bones floating in the dark. Their running lights pulsed in synchronized patterns, each pulse carrying data, each interval between pulses carrying more data. Even their aesthetics were functional. Even their silence communicated. Overmind Tesek 4 commanded that network. Not a single organism, but a distributed consciousness, a hierarchy of processing nodes that had been continuously operational for 412 years. Every diplomatic engagement the Kesari had conducted in that time, every arbitration, every trade framework, every border negotiation, every ceasefire, every currency adjustment, every sovereignty dispute, had been shaped by Tesek 4 modeling. The intelligence files Morrow had memorized contained a particular statistic that she returned to often. In 412 years of arbitration, Tesek 4 had never lost a resolution vote. Not once. Across 947 resolutions, the Overmind had predicted the outcome correctly every single time, because it didn't merely predict, it shaped. Never. She intended to change that. The 2 hours Morrow had demanded were not spent idle. She convened her senior staff in the Hearthstone's flag briefing room, a low-ceilinged space deep inside the ship's armored core, lined with signal-dampening paneling, and sealed against every form of surveillance the Terran intelligence community had ever catalogued, and several it had only theorized. The air inside tasted faintly of recycled copper, a side effect of the electromagnetic shielding that made the room invisible to external sensors. Here's where we are. Morrow activated the holographic display. A map of political alignments materialized, 48 polities represented by colored nodes, with lines of varying thickness connecting them. The Kesari drafted Resolution 1187, 11 co-sponsors. The Vethanar Combine is hosting, which means they're officially neutral, but their fleet positioning tells a different story. 42 naval vessels in the inner perimeter, all with weapons hot cycling in their power plants. You don't bring that much firepower to a neutral event. The Combine's been trading weapons-grade processing cores with the Kesari for 2 decades, said Captain Ren Halstrom, commanding the destroyer screen. He was a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and the particular stillness of someone who had spent too many years in small ships waiting for something to shoot at. Neutral like a loaded gun sitting on a table. That's one way to read it, Morrow agreed. The co-sponsors break down into 3 tiers. First tier, the Kesari, the Othran Mandate, the Palathi Union are true believers. They genuinely think our fleet represents an existential destabilization. They've modeled it. Their models say that a fleet our size, with our weapons yields, changes the incentive structure for every other polity within range. Deterrence collapses because no one can deter us. Alliance structures weaken because alliances become irrelevant when one member can unilaterally outgun any coalition. Their models, Vasek said dryly, assume we'd actually use the fleet offensively. Their models assume the capacity itself is destabilizing regardless of intent, and they're not entirely wrong from a game theory perspective. A force that cannot be matched changes the calculation for everyone. That's the argument they'll make, and it's a good one. She let that sit for a moment. Officers who expected their admiral to dismiss the opposition's logic outright were officers she couldn't use. The question isn't whether they're right about the math. It's whether the math is all there is. Second tier, she continued. The Dren Confederacy, the Shulari Collective, the Varesi Republic, and the Korlani systems. These are alignment votes. They co-sponsored because the Kesari asked them to, and because voting against a Kesari-backed resolution has historically cost more than voting with it. They don't care about our fleet. They care about not being on the wrong side of Tessek 4. Leverage, Halstrom asked. That's what the next 17 hours are for. Morrow zoomed the display to the threshold station itself, its structure rendered in translucent wireframe, a massive ring station with 6 docking arms radiating outward, each arm hosting multiple berths for diplomatic and military vessels. Third tier, the Ildari Protectorate, the Massan Sovereignty, the Tavik Commerce Authority, and the Orn Sethi Directorate. Opportunists. They co-sponsored because the resolution includes secondary provisions, trade access, border adjustments, technology-sharing frameworks that benefit them specifically. They're not voting to disarm us. They're voting to get paid. So we outbid the Kesari, said Commander Ian Pell, the Hearthstone's weapons officer. She was young for her rank, sharp, and had the habit of reducing complex situations to their simplest component. We don't outbid anyone, Morrow said. We change what they're calculating. The room was quiet. 14 officers, the senior staff of the Terran Interdiction Group, watching their admiral draw lines on a holographic map with the same precision she would use to plot firing solutions. Because that was what this was, a firing solution. The targets were votes. The weapons were information, and the kill radius was measured in political capital. The briefing continued for another 40 minutes. Morrow assigned intelligence tasks, intercept analysis on the Kesari communication network, diplomatic contact schedules with the second-tier delegations, a detailed threat assessment of the station's defense grid, and a comprehensive review of every bilateral trade agreement the Kesari had signed in the past 5 years. When the room emptied, she remained, studying the display alone. 48 polities, 31 voting seats on the convergence floor, 16 votes to pass. The Kesari had 11 co-sponsors and the Combine's quiet support, that was 13, possibly 14 if the Combine dropped its neutrality pretense. Morrow needed to hold 18 seats to block. She had Earth's vote, the votes of 4 human-aligned species states, and the grudging support of 6 uncommitted moderates who distrusted the Kesari, but feared antagonizing them more than they feared anything else. 11 votes. She needed 7 more, and the session opened in 19 hours. She opened the intelligence file on her personal display, the one that wasn't connected to any network, that had been loaded from a physical data crystal hand-carried by a courier who had traveled 14 days to deliver it. The file contained something TESEC 4 network had never seen, the Kesari's own internal model for post-resolution implementation, obtained not through signals intelligence or cyber warfare, but through the oldest intelligence method in existence. A disaffected Kesari subordinate node, a processing cluster in the Overmind's 6th tier of hierarchy, had been gradually diverging from the network consensus for the past 97 years. Not rebelling, diverging, reaching conclusions that differed from the Overminds by fractions too small to trigger correction algorithms but large enough, over nearly a century, to constitute an independent assessment. The divergent node's assessment, Resolution 1187, was not about human disarmament. It was about Kesari consolidation. The enforcement framework would give the Kesari permanent military presence in corridors they currently had no legal right to enter. The verification sensors would give them real-time intelligence on every polity within range. The phased disarmament schedule would remove the only force in the galactic record capable of resisting Kesari arbitration by non-diplomatic means. Morrow closed the file. The divergent node had not transmitted this assessment to anyone. It had been extracted over 7 years by a Terran intelligence operative who had spent those 7 years pretending to be a maintenance contractor for the Kesari's secondary relay stations, building trust with the node's local interface at the speed of machine logic friendship, one verified data point at a time. 7 years, 1 operative, 1 divergent node, 1 file. And now Morrow had to win a vote. Ambassador Drevin was waiting in the quiet Meridian's conference suite, a compact room paneled in the pale wood analog that Combine stations used for diplomatic spaces. The grain pattern was artificial but convincing, designed to put biological species at ease, a courtesy the Combine extended to everyone regardless of whether they had evolved on a planet with trees. Drevin rose when Morrow entered, her expression carrying the particular strain of someone who had been carrying a problem alone for too long. "Admiral, thank you for coming." "Ambassador." Morrow took the offered seat. The room's environmental systems hummed at a frequency designed to mask conversation from exterior sensors. Morrow's implant confirmed the masking was active but noted 3 passive surveillance nodes embedded in the ceiling panels. Combine standard, likely recording metadata if not content. She said nothing about them. Instead, she noted the second detail, Drevin's hands. They were still. Diplomats whose hands were still were diplomats who had already decided something. "I'll be direct," Drevin said. "The procedural challenge I've been building, the argument that Resolution 1187 violates the sovereignty provisions of the Compact of Settled Worlds, has collapsed." The Kesari filed an advisory opinion with the juridical panel 3 days ago, and the panel ruled, 5-2, that the resolution falls within the Convergence's authority. "When were you going to tell me?" "I'm telling you now." Morrow studied the ambassador's face. Dreven was not a weak woman. She had negotiated the Arthen Corridor trade framework, brokered a ceasefire between the Dren and Shilari that had held for 14 years, and survived 2 assassination attempts by species that preferred kinetic diplomacy. But she was a diplomat, and diplomats worked within systems. When the system turned against them, they looked for someone operating outside it. "The panel's ruling changes the terrain," Morrow said. "It doesn't change the objective." "Admiral, without the procedural block, the resolution goes to a straight floor vote. The Kesari have the numbers. Tesek 4 has been modeling this for, we believe, over 60 years. Every delegation that arrives has already received a custom proposal from the Kesari tailored to their specific economic and security interests. Every vote is pre-negotiated. The overmind doesn't leave variables unsolved." "Not every vote," Morrow said. Dreven paused. "Which ones?" Morrow leaned forward slightly. "The Pelathi Union's delegation includes Subdirector Orvan Kethai, who holds a personal grievance against the Kesari dating back to their annexation of the Pelathi border worlds 40 years ago. He co-sponsored because his government told him to, but he's been sending back-channel communications to the Ildari Protectorate questioning the enforcement mechanisms. Specifically, the deployment timeline for sensor nodes in Pelathi sovereign space. The Ildari, meanwhile, are about to discover that the secondary trade provisions the Kesari promised them conflict directly with the Varesi Republic's provisions. The Kesari promised the same corridor access to both, knowing they couldn't deliver both simultaneously. Dreven's expression shifted, the controlled surprise of someone who has underestimated a colleague. "How do you know about the back-channel communications?" "Because I've been reading the same intelligence files Tesek 4 has been writing, Ambassador. The difference is that I've been reading the ones Tesek 4 didn't write too." She paused. "Your procedural challenge was the right approach inside the system, but the Kesari operate the system. You can't beat the house by playing the house's game." "Then what game are we playing?" "Theirs, just not the way they expect." The 19 hours before the session became the most consequential period of Morrow's career, and she had commanded a warship through the Battle of the Cathara Narrows, where 9 human destroyers had held a corridor against 2,000 Dren raiders for 11 hours, while civilian transports evacuated a failing colony. She had lost 2 ships and 47 crew members in that engagement. She still remembered every name. This was harder. Harder because the weapons were invisible, and the casualties would be measured in centuries of political alignment. She worked from the Hearthstone's flag suite, running 3 operations simultaneously. The first was diplomatic, a series of precisely timed meetings with second- and third-tier delegations, each lasting no more than 30 minutes, each delivering a single piece of information calibrated to that delegation's specific anxiety. The timing mattered as much as the content. Too early, and the delegations would have time to consult the Kesari. Too late, and the information wouldn't settle before the vote. To the Dren Confederacy's senior delegate, a barrel-chested amphibian whose chromatophores made his emotional state impossible to hide, she presented, casually, as though it were common knowledge, the Kesari's internal modeling for post-disarmament force redistribution. The model showed the Kesari absorbing 62% of the enforcement mandate, giving them permanent military presence in corridors the Dren considered sovereign. This is the enforcement framework they're proposing. The Dren delegate's chromatophores flushed a dark, angry violet that spread from his jawline to the crown ridges above his eyes. This puts their arbitration platforms inside the Kethrine Reach. That corridor has been Dren's sovereign space for 600 years. Our own fleet doesn't station warships there. It's a diplomatic buffer zone. Under the resolution's current text, enforcement jurisdiction follows the arbitrating authority, Morrow said. The Kesari drafted that provision. Paragraph 91, subsection 4. You'll find it unremarkable on first reading. Most enforcement jurisdiction clauses look similar. But cross-reference it with the deployment schedule in Appendix D, and you'll see the staging timelines put Kesari platforms in the Catherine Reach within 18 months of ratification. We co-sponsored this resolution. You did. She let the silence do the work. The Dren delegates' chromatophores cycled through 3 shades of violet, before settling on a dark, bruised indigo that Morrow's intelligence files identified as deep anger held under formal restraint. To the Shilari Collective, she offered something different, a detailed technical analysis showing that the sensor networks the Kesari intended to deploy as part of the disarmament verification regime would, by design, give the Kesari real-time intelligence coverage of every Shilari military installation within range. The analysis was precise, specific, and included manufacturing specifications for the sensor nodes that the Shilari's own engineers could verify independently. These are the same nodes they deployed along the Arthen corridor last year, Morrow said. Your engineers examined them and found nothing unusual, but the firmware update pushed 6 months ago added a passive collection layer. It piggybacks on the standard arbitration frequency band, using the verification data stream as cover for a secondary intelligence feed. Here are the packet signatures. Your communications directorate can confirm them against their own monitoring logs. The Shilari delegates' compound eyes fixed on the data for a long time. The Shilari were an insectoid species. Their biology made them difficult to read by human standards, but Morrow had studied them. When a Shilari held perfectly still with all 4 manipulating limbs flat against the table's surface, they were processing threat data, fight or flight at the species level. The delegate stayed still for 47 seconds. How did you obtain these specifications? The delegate asked. The firmware was deployed to sensor nodes along the Arthen corridor, which is a jointly monitored zone under the Dren-Shilari ceasefire accords. Terran fleet assets participate in the joint monitoring mission. Our engineers examined the nodes as part of routine maintenance. Morrow paused. We were surprised, too. To the Varesi Republic, she simply forwarded, through a carefully anonymized channel, the Kesari's trade corridor proposal to the Ildari Protectorate. When the Varesi delegate compared it to their own proposal and found the overlap, the identical corridor segments, the identical exclusivity clauses, the identical language promising sole access to trade routes that could not physically be granted to 2 polities simultaneously, the conversation with the Kesari delegation that followed was audible 3 compartments away. The Varesi valued personal honor above nearly everything else in their diplomatic culture. Being lied to was an offense. Being lied to with identical documents was an insult. The second operation was electronic. The Hearthstone's signals intelligence team, working under Commander Vasik's direct supervision, had been intercepting and cataloging the Kesari communication network's traffic patterns since arrival. They couldn't decrypt the content. The Kesari's encryption was quantum-layered, running on processing architectures that predated most of the galaxy's current civilizations, and was, by all assessments, unbreakable with current technology. But they didn't need the content. They needed the patterns. The network traffic between the 11 Kesari ships follows a predictive cycle, Vasik reported, standing at the flag suite's secondary display where traffic analysis played out in colored waveforms. Every 4 hours, there's a synchronization burst, all 11 nodes align simultaneously, forming a unified processing state that lasts between 11 and 14 minutes. Between synchronizations, communication is distributed and adaptive. Each node operates semi-independently. But during the burst, the entire network is processing a single unified model. The galactic state model, Morrow said. TESEC 4 is updating its prediction of how every delegation will vote, factoring in every interaction, every communication, every facial expression its sensors have captured. Yes, Admiral. The model integrates everything, biometric data from delegates in range of Kesari sensors, communication traffic patterns, even ambient noise analysis from the station's public spaces. and it's adjusting its diplomatic approach in real time based on those predictions. Every conversation every Kesari delegate has is scripted by the network. The synchronization burst generates the updated script. The delegates execute it in the interval between bursts. How confident is the model right now? Vasek highlighted a waveform pattern. The synchronization bursts have been shortening since our arrival, down from 14 minutes to 11.3. Shorter bursts indicate higher consensus among the processing nodes. Higher consensus indicates higher confidence in the model's accuracy. Morrow nodded. Good. Then we know when it's most confident. And when it's most confident is when it's most vulnerable, because confidence means it stopped looking for variables it hasn't solved. The third operation was the one Morrow had told no one about, not Vasek, not Drevin, not the intelligence staff. It required no communication, no meetings, no data transfers. It required only the Hearthstone, sitting precisely where she was, at the edge of the demarcation perimeter, her 14-ship formation holding steady. Because the Hearthstone's presence was not a diplomatic gesture, it was a variable. Tesek 4 model, any sufficiently sophisticated model, would account for the Terran fleet's presence. It would factor their tonnage, their weapons signatures, their known capabilities, their historical engagement patterns. It would calculate the probability of military escalation at various decision points and adjust its recommendations accordingly. And because Tesek 4 was a rational optimizer, it would treat the fleet's presence as a known quantity, a solved variable, and move on to the variables it could actually manipulate. Votes, trade offers, threats, promises. The fleet was 14 ships. Tesek 4 could see 14 ships. Tesek 4 could model 14 ships. What Tesek 4 could not see was why those 14 ships were the ones Morrow had brought, not the 16 she'd been authorized, not the 12 that would have been sufficient for a diplomatic escort, but 14. The number itself was a message, but only if you knew whom it was for. Morrow had served with Orvan Kethai's former military advisor, a Pelathi officer named Trevin Selk, during a joint patrol operation 9 years ago. During that operation, Selk had mentioned, in passing, over a meal neither of them would officially acknowledge, that the Pelathi considered the number 14 sacred. 14 founders, 14 oaths, 14 ships at the Battle of Pelathi Prime, the last time the Pelathi had defied a galactic consensus and survived. This was the mistake Morrow was counting on, not Tesek 4 mistake. The Overmind didn't make mistakes in the conventional sense. It made optimal calculations based on available data. The mistake was structural, a consciousness that treated every input as data could not distinguish between data and meaning. 14 ships was data. What 14 ships meant to a Pelathi subdirector with a 40-year grievance, that was something else entirely. The convergence session opened at 800 station local, in a chamber designed for exactly this kind of theater. The floor was circular, tiered in concentric rings, the inner ring for the 31 voting delegations, the outer rings for observers, advisors, and the inevitable crowd of diplomatic functionaries who attended these events, the way atmosphere attended a planet. The combine speaker occupied the central dais, a raised platform that rotated slowly, ensuring every delegation had equal visual access. The chamber's lighting was calibrated to accommodate every visual spectrum represented among the attending species, giving the air a faintly prismatic quality that made the space feel larger than it was. Morrow attended in person, which was unusual for a military commander at a diplomatic proceeding. She wore her fleet uniform, plain, dark, no medals, and sat in the observation tier directly behind Earth's voting delegation, close enough that every sensor in the room could confirm she was there. Every biosensor, every Kesari passive array, every diplomatic intelligence officer from every delegation who cared to look. She wanted them looking. Tesek 4 Avatar occupied the Kesari delegation's central position, a translucent geometric form roughly 2 meters tall that shifted constantly, each configuration representing a different processing state. When it spoke, the voice was synthesized but modulated to carry authority, a flat, precise baritone that filled the chamber without effort and without warmth. The resolution before this convergence addresses a structural asymmetry that has persisted for 111 years, TESEC 4 began. The human species currently maintains a deployed military force exceeding any reasonable defensive requirement by a factor of 14.7. This force includes 3,800 warships of cruiser displacement or greater, 19 orbital construction facilities capable of producing capital-class vessels, and weapons systems whose yield-to-mass ratios exceed the galactic median by a factor of 9. No other species in the cataloged archive maintains a comparable force-to-population ratio. No species in recorded history has maintained such a ratio for this duration without eventual offensive deployment. Numbers, precise, specific, verifiable numbers. Morrow recognized the technique, the same technique she used. When you wanted to move a room, you didn't appeal to fear. You appealed to math. Fear was subjective, arguable, dismissible. Math was not. Resolution 1187 proposes a phased, supervised reduction of this force to levels consistent with legitimate self-defense, as defined by the Compact of Settled Worlds. The reduction schedule spans 40 standard years. Verification is conducted by a multilateral body with representation from all participating polities. The framework is not punitive, it is structural. It addresses the asymmetry itself, not the species that created it. Earth's delegate, Ambassador Dreven's deputy, a steady man named Forster who had been chosen for this role precisely because his composure was nearly geological, raised his procedural marker. The Earth delegation notes that the juridical panel's advisory opinion on jurisdiction was issued with 2 dissents, and that the dissenting opinions raised substantive questions regarding the applicability of the Compact's sovereignty provisions to unilateral force-level mandates imposed on a single signatory. The advisory opinion was decided by majority, TESEC 4 replied, without pause. The dissenting opinions have been entered into the record. Their substantive arguments were addressed in the majority's analysis at paragraphs 47 through 63. This body operates under majority jurisprudence. The dissents do not diminish the ruling. First blood to the Kesari. The procedural challenge was dead, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Morrow watched Forster nod, accepting the ruling with exactly the right amount of formal reluctance, not defeated, but acknowledging that this particular avenue was closed. He played his part well. Morrow had briefed him on what to expect and what expression to wear when it happened. The debate continued for 4 hours. Delegation after delegation rose to state positions, ask questions, and perform the intricate diplomatic choreography that species states conducted when they wanted to be seen doing something without committing to anything. The Othran mandate delivered a 20-minute statistical analysis supporting the Kesari's destabilization thesis. The Korlani systems asked 3 questions about enforcement timelines that had clearly been prescripted by the Kesari network. 2 uncommitted delegations, the Ortheni Republic and the Saravi Dominion, made statements so carefully neutral that their positions were indistinguishable from silence. Morrow tracked every statement, cross-referencing it with her intelligence files, watching for the fractures she'd spent the past 19 hours creating. The first fracture appeared at hour 3. The Dren Confederacy's delegate rose, his chromatophore cycling through the formal spectrum of diplomatic address, before settling on the dark indigo Morrow had seen the previous evening. The Dren delegation has studied the enforcement framework appended to Resolution 1187 and notes with concern that the proposed jurisdiction matrix allocates a disproportionate enforcement presence to corridors currently recognized as falling within Dren sovereign space. We request a formal amendment to Section 14, specifying that enforcement operations within sovereign corridors require bilateral consent. The room shifted. Not dramatically. The movements were small, subtle, the kind of recalibration that happened when a position that had seemed solid revealed a crack. 12 delegates turned to look at the Kesari platform simultaneously. Morrow saw TESEC 4 geometric avatar flicker through 3 configuration changes in rapid succession: processing, recalculating, adjusting the model. The Kesari delegate assigned to handle the Dren, a secondary node that operated with TESEC 4 authority but presented as a separate individual, responded within seconds. A prepared counterargument that acknowledged the sovereignty concern, offered a bilateral consultation mechanism as a procedural safeguard, and reframed the enforcement jurisdiction as temporary, reviewable, and subject to annual oversight. It was smooth, precise, perfectly calibrated. And it was exactly the response Morrow had predicted. She'd spent 3 hours that morning modeling TESEC 4 probable responses to 17 different objection scenarios. For each scenario, she'd estimated the Kesari's reply, the downstream effect on the uncommitted delegations, and the second-order reactions. Which delegations would be reassured, which would grow more suspicious, and which would begin their own private calculations about whether the Kesari's model was as infallible as its 400-year record suggested. The Dren delegate hesitated, then withdrew the amendment request, but the seed was planted. The Shulari delegate, watching from 3 seats away, had noted the Dren's concern, and the speed with which the Kesari had neutralized it. Speed, in the Shulari's threat processing framework, indicated preparation. Preparation indicated anticipation. Anticipation indicated that the Kesari had known about the Dren's concern before the Dren had raised it, which meant the Kesari were monitoring internal Dren deliberations. At hour 5, the Shulari rose. The Shulari Collective requests a technical review of the verification sensor specifications outlined in Appendix C of Resolution 1187. Specifically, we note that the passive collection capabilities of the proposed sensor nodes exceed the requirements of arms verification by a significant margin and may constitute an independent intelligence-gathering network operating under the legal cover of disarmament verification. This time, TESEC 4 Avatar held a single configuration for 11 seconds, an eternity for a distributed consciousness that normally cycled configurations every 2 to 3 seconds. The network was working, running scenarios, calculating the probability that this objection was organic versus externally seeded, computing the optimal response across multiple stakeholder matrices. The sensor specifications in Appendix C are standard arbitration-grade monitoring systems, TESEC 4 replied. Their capabilities are consistent with the requirements of arms verification as defined by the Joint Technical Standards Commission in precedent cases 7, 19, and 31. The Shulari delegation has obtained independent technical analysis suggesting otherwise, the Shulari delegate said. We will submit this analysis to the convergence record and request that the Technical Standards Commission conduct a fresh review before the vote. A fresh technical review would take weeks. It wouldn't stop the vote. The convergence could proceed on schedule, but it would give uncommitted delegations a reason to abstain rather than vote yes. And abstentions, under convergence rules, counted against the majority. Morrow watched TESEC 4 cycle through configurations. She could almost feel the calculations, the vast, cold, beautiful mathematics of a consciousness that had been optimizing outcomes for 4 centuries, running a scenario it hadn't predicted. Not because the Shulari's objection was unpredictable. TESEC 4 had certainly modeled the possibility that delegations would question the sensor specifications. What it hadn't modeled was the specific technical analysis Morrow had provided, with its specific packet signatures, its specific firmware evidence. delivered through a channel that the Kesari's communication intercepts hadn't captured, because it had been transmitted by courier drone from the Hearthstone using protocols that predated the Kesari's founding by 300 years. Old technology, so old it didn't register on modern intercept arrays, like a handwritten letter in a world of quantum-encrypted transmissions. The session recessed at hour 7. Morrow remained in her seat as the chamber emptied, watching Tesek 4 avatar hover motionless on the Kesari delegation platform. The avatar's configurations had slowed to 1 every 8 seconds, deep processing. The network was rebuilding its model from the ground up. During the recess, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, the Varesi Republic's delegate confronted the Kesari delegation publicly, in a corridor, within range of 11 different diplomatic surveillance systems, about the conflicting trade corridor provisions. The confrontation lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The Varesi delegate spoke in the flat, measured tone of someone who had been promised something and discovered it was a lie, and who valued the insult more than the loss. The Kesari delegate's response was technically adequate but emotionally null, a correction of facts without acknowledgement of the offense. For a species that valued personal honor above diplomatic convenience, this was worse than the lie itself. Second, the Ildari Protectorate's delegation issued a formal request for a 3-day recess to review newly surfaced inconsistencies in the resolution's secondary provisions. The request was denied under convergence procedural rules, but it signaled loudly, clearly, with the diplomatic equivalent of a flare, that the Ildari's co-sponsorship was wobbling. Third, Subdirector Orvan Kethe of the Pelathi Union requested a private meeting with Admiral Morrow. They met in a maintenance corridor on the station's lower ring, Kethe's choice, which told Morrow everything she needed to know about his relationship with his own delegation. He was a tall, thin-limbed figure, his skin the matte gray-blue of Pelathi polar stock, his 4 eyes blinking in asynchronous patterns that Pelathi behavioral studies identified as acute stress. His formal robes were immaculate, but his hands, 4-fingered, with the fine motor tremor that Pelathi exhibited under emotional load, were clasped tightly behind his back in a conscious effort at stillness. "I know what you're doing," Kethe said. His voice was quiet, precise, and carried the particular weight of someone who had been watching a performance and recognized the choreography. "I'm attending a diplomatic session as an observer," Morrow replied. "You're dismantling a 400-year-old optimization engine 1 variable at a time, and you're doing it so precisely that the engine can't tell the difference between your interference and organic diplomatic friction." Kethe's upper eyes, the ones Pelathi used for distance assessment, for reading the broad shape of a situation, narrowed. "It's remarkable. I've been watching Kesari arbitration since I was a junior at Hachet. I've never seen anyone introduce enough noise to degrade the model's accuracy, without the model detecting the source." "I appreciate the observation. I didn't come here to compliment you, Admiral. I came to tell you it isn't enough." He unclasped his hands and let them fall to his sides, a Pelathi gesture of vulnerable honesty. Even with the Dren wavering, the Shilari requesting a technical review, and the Varesi publicly furious with the Kesari, Tesek 4 still holds the numbers. The network has been recalculating since the recess began, and it's already generated alternative proposals for the 2nd and 3rd-tier delegations. By the time the session resumes, most of the damage you've done will be repaired. "Most," Morrow said. "Most, maybe all. Tesek 4 has been doing this for 412 years. It doesn't get outmaneuvered by a single admiral with intelligence files." "Then why are you here?" Kethe was quiet for a moment. His lower eyes, the ones Pelathi used for close focus, for reading intentions, for the intimate assessment of whether the person in front of them was telling the truth, fixed on Morrow's face with an intensity that felt almost physical. "Because 40 years ago, The Kesari solved the Palathi border dispute by annexing our three richest worlds and calling it optimal redistribution. My government accepted because TESEC 4 model showed it was the best available outcome, the least costly, the most stable, the most beneficial in aggregate. Every model since has confirmed it. Every analysis, every review, every independent assessment has concluded that the Kesari solution was, in fact, optimal. He paused. I'd like to see a model that doesn't. Why? Because optimal and right are not the same thing, Admiral. And 400 years of never being wrong has made the galaxy forget that. Morrow met his gaze. The corridor was silent except for the hum of the station's environmental systems and the distant vibration of docking mechanisms cycling. What do you need? She asked. I need the resolution to fail. And I need it to fail in a way that TESEC 4 cannot attribute to organic diplomatic friction, in a way that breaks the assumption that the network's model is always correct. Because if the model fails publicly, it isn't just one resolution that falls. It's the 400-year consensus that the Kesari always know the optimal outcome. That's a big ask. You brought 14 warships to a diplomatic session, Admiral. You didn't do that for decoration. He held her gaze, all four eyes focused. 14 ships, I noticed the number. Morrow's expression did not change. I need your vote, publicly, on the floor before the final tally, not an abstention, a no vote, from a co-sponsor. Kethai's chromatophores pulsed once, a single wash of color that Morrow's files identified as the Palathi equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. If I do that, my government will recall me. Probably. I lose my position, my pension, my standing. 40 years of service gone. Probably. And you'll have your 17th vote. One short. I'll have what I need, Morrow said. The 17th vote isn't a number, Subdirector. It's a signal. When a co-sponsor defects, every uncommitted delegation recalculates, not using TESEC 4 model, but using their own. And their own models have been telling them something different from the networks for a long time. They've just been too afraid to trust them. Kethai said nothing for 32 seconds. Morrow counted. In diplomatic encounters, she always counted. The length of a silence told you more than the words that followed it. I'll need a guarantee, he said. If the resolution fails, I'll need somewhere to go. The Palathi government won't want me, and the Kesari will make sure no aligned polity touches me. The Terran diplomatic service has a long memory for allies, Subdirector, and a long reach. The session resumed at hour 11. Morrow returned to her seat. She had made no communications during the recess, no messages sent from the Hearthstone, no encrypted traffic, no courier drones. She had spoken to Kethai in a maintenance corridor with no surveillance coverage, in a meeting that lasted 9 minutes, about which no record existed in any system the Kesari could access. TESEC 4 had rebuilt its model. The Kesari delegates had conducted 7 bilateral meetings during the recess, each delivering revised proposals that addressed the specific concerns raised in the first session. The Dren received an amended enforcement jurisdiction clause with stronger sovereignty language. The Shilari received a promise that the Technical Standards Commission would conduct a review, after the vote, with Shilari observer rights. The Varesi received a revised trade corridor proposal that, on paper, resolved the conflict with the Ildari provisions by splitting the disputed corridor into 2 segments with alternating access schedules. It was masterful work, 400 years of optimization applied in 7 hours. Each revised proposal was precisely calibrated to the receiving delegation's concerns, precisely worded to resolve the specific objection without conceding the framework's substance, precisely timed to arrive after the delegation had absorbed the bad news, but before they had committed to opposing the resolution. The debate resumed with formal statements from the uncommitted delegations. Morrow tracked the language, the tone, the specific phrases each delegate used. Most were hedging standard diplomatic ambiguity designed to preserve flexibility until the last possible moment. But 3 delegates used phrases that Morrow recognized from Kesari proposal templates, specific formulations that TESEC 4 network inserted into its diplomatic communications, phrases designed to signal alignment without formal commitment. 3 more votes for the Kesari. That put them at 16 or 17, right at the threshold. The vote was called at hour 14. The combined speaker rotated the dais to face each delegation in turn, calling the roll in the order established by founding precedent. The votes came in precisely as TESEC 4 model predicted. The Kesari and their first-tier allies voting yes immediately, the aligned delegations following in sequence, each yes landing with the mechanical inevitability of a machine executing its program. After 15 delegations had voted, the tally stood at 11 yes, 4 no. Morrow's count said the next 5 votes were locks for the Kesari, all second-tier alignments, all pre-negotiated, all operating within the network's model. The 16th delegation was called the Corlani Systems. Yes, the Corlani delegate said, 12 yes. The 17th, the Masson Sovereignty, yes, 13. The 18th, the Tavik Commerce Authority, yes, 14. 3 more to reach 16. 13 delegations remaining. Morrow held 6 committed no votes among them. That left 7 delegations that would decide the outcome. The 19th delegation was called the Pelathi Union. The Chamber's attention shifted to the Pelathi platform. TESEC 4 model had the Pelathi as a locked yes, a co-sponsor, a 40-year Kesari-aligned polity, a delegation whose vote had been confirmed in bilateral negotiations 3 times during the recess. The model's confidence level for the Pelathi vote, if it could be expressed in human terms, would have been described as absolute. Orvan Kethai stood. His 4 eyes were open, all focused on the central dais, his hands at his sides. His chromatophores were still, the pale gray-blue of his polar complexion, no flush, no pulse, perfectly composed. The Pelathi Union votes no. The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. In a chamber containing 300 sentient beings representing 31 species states, 6 seconds of absolute silence was an event with its own gravity. Morrow watched TESEC 4 Avatar. The geometric form froze in a configuration she had never seen documented in any intelligence file, all angles static, all surfaces aligned, every facet reflecting the chamber's prismatic light without movement. Full processing halt. The network's model had just encountered a variable it had classified as solved, a variable that had unsolved itself. The murmuring started, delegates leaning toward advisors, chromatophores shifting colors across the Dren contingent, compound eyes pivoting among the Shulari 4-eyed species blinking in patterns that indicated confusion, alarm, recalculation. The diplomatic functionaries in the outer rings were leaning forward, their recording devices active, their expressions carrying the particular hunger of people who knew they were witnessing something that would be studied for decades. Morrow sat still. This was the moment, not the vote itself, but the 6 seconds of silence and the murmuring that followed. Because in those 6 seconds, every uncommitted delegation had done exactly what she'd told Kethai they would do. They had stopped trusting the network's model and started trusting their own. The 20th delegation was called the Orthony Republic. Precession modeling had classified them as a likely yes. The Orthony Republic abstains. Abstention, not a no but not the yes that TESEC 4 had predicted. The model was cracking. The 21st, the Saravi Dominion, another likely yes. The Saravi Dominion abstains. 2 abstentions. Under convergence rules, abstentions did not count toward the majority threshold, but they also didn't count against it. The yes count was still 14, but the pool of remaining delegates was shrinking, and the Kesari needed 2 more from an increasingly nervous room. The 22nd delegation was called the Cathani Trade League, abstention. The 23rd, the Vorath Assembly, abstention. The 24th, the Orn Sethai Directorate. The Orn Sethai had co-sponsored the resolution. Their delegate stood, looked at the Kesari platform for a long moment and said, "No." Another co-sponsor defection. The room's noise level doubled. Morrow watched the mathematics collapse, not like a building falling, like a tide going out. Quiet, inexorable, the numbers simply not arriving where the model said they would. Tesek 4 Avatar was cycling through configurations so rapidly that the translucent geometric form appeared to vibrate, its surfaces blurring into a continuous shimmer that cast fractured light across the chamber walls. By the 28th delegation, the tally stood at 14 yes, 11 no, 3 abstentions. The Kesari needed 2 more yes votes from the remaining 3 delegations. But those 3 delegations, all uncommitted moderates who had been wavering since the first session, were watching a room that had stopped moving in the direction the network predicted. The 29th delegation, the Vashti Concordance. The Vashti Concordance votes no. 14 yes, 12 no. The Kesari needed both remaining votes. The 30th, the Kellen Systems, abstain. 14 yes, 12 no, 4 abstentions. 1 delegation remaining. Even if they voted yes, the tally would be 15, 1 short of the 16 required for passage. Resolution 1187 had failed. Tesek 4 Avatar froze. Not the rapid cycling of recalculation, not the slow configurations of deep processing. Frozen. A static geometric form hovering above the Kesari delegation platform, every surface still, every angle locked, every facet dark. For the first time in 412 years of continuous operation, across 948 attempted resolutions, the network had encountered an outcome it had not predicted. The chamber erupted not in celebration, not in anger, but in the chaotic, overlapping noise of 300 beings trying to understand what had just happened. Delegations turned to each other, to their advisors, to their intelligence staffs. The Kesari delegation sat motionless, 11 secondary nodes, all frozen, all waiting for the Overmind to issue new processing directives. Morrow stood, she didn't hurry. She straightened her uniform, nodded once to Forster and walked toward the exit. As she passed the Kesari delegation platform, Tesek 4 Avatar rotated to face her, an acknowledgement, the first non-diplomatic gesture the network had made in the entire proceeding. Admiral Morrow. The synthesized voice was flat, precise, unchanged, but the Avatar's configuration, a form Morrow had never seen in any intelligence file, suggested something she wouldn't have attributed to a machine consciousness: uncertainty. The outcome of this vote was not within projected parameters. The deviation from predicted behavior in 7 delegations simultaneously exceeds the probability threshold for organic diplomatic variance by a factor of 11. This suggests external manipulation of the voting body. Morrow stopped. She turned to face the Avatar. 300 beings in the chamber fell quiet, watching. External manipulation, she repeated. That's one interpretation. The alternative interpretation is that the model is incomplete. Yes. An incomplete model implies the existence of variables the network has not identified. What variables, Admiral? Morrow looked at the Avatar for a long moment. The chamber was absolutely silent again, that same weight she'd felt when Kethai had voted no, the weight of 300 beings holding their breath. The dais was still rotating. The prismatic light was still shifting. And the Overmind, for the first time in 4 centuries, was asking a question it did not already know the answer to. Your model accounts for every warship in this sector, Overmind. Their tonnage, their weapons, their positions, their historical engagement patterns. Your model accounts for every treaty, every trade relationship, every diplomatic precedent in 900 years of galactic law. Your model accounts for every delegate in this chamber, their voting histories, their economic interests, their personal grievances, their psychological profiles. She paused. Your model does not account for the fact that some of them would rather lose within their own judgment than win within yours. TESEC 4 avatar held its configuration for 4 seconds. That variable, it said, is not quantifiable. No, Morrow said, it isn't. She left the chamber. On the Hearthstone's bridge, Vasek was waiting. The ship systems were nominal, the fleet holding formation, the station sensors still painting them with the same active scans that had been running since their arrival. Admiral, the vote failed. The Kesari delegation has requested a formal review of the proceedings, but under convergence rules, a failed resolution cannot be reintroduced for 11 standard years. 11 years, Morrow said. In 11 years, the fleet will be 40% larger, 27 orbital construction facilities instead of 19. The Kesari know that. Yes, Admiral. There's also a diplomatic note from Subdirector Kethai. His government has issued a recall order. He's requested, through Ambassador Dreven's office, political asylum with the Terran Diplomatic Service. Granted, Morrow didn't hesitate. Full diplomatic status. Station him somewhere useful, the Arthen Corridor Liaison Office. He knows the Kesari's methods better than anyone we've got. Aye, Admiral. Morrow walked to the command display and looked at the formation, her 14 ships against the backdrop of the threshold, the Kesari's 11 warships still holding their position on the far side. 2 forces, facing each other across a diplomatic station, neither having fired a shot. The entire engagement had been conducted in words, in data, in the precise manipulation of trust and doubt. 3,800 warships in the human fleet, and not one of them had done the work that mattered today. Signal the fleet, she said. Prepare for departure. Course, Admiral. Morrow looked at the display one last time. The Kesari formation was already beginning to shift, the 11 ships realigning, their communication network cycling through new configurations as the Overmind rebuilt its model from scratch. It would learn from this. It would adapt. In 11 years, when the resolution could be reintroduced, TESEC 4 would have a model that accounted for every variable Morrow had exploited today. The courier drones, the ancient protocols, the technical analyses, the carefully timed bilateral meetings. But it would also carry the knowledge that its model had failed, publicly. In front of 31 voting delegations and 300 witnesses, and every polity that had voted based on the network's 400-year track record of infallibility would carry that knowledge too. The next time the Kesari proposed a resolution, the room would remember this one. The next time TESEC 4 model predicted an outcome with absolute confidence, 7 delegations would remember the day they had trusted their own judgment instead, and the galaxy had not ended. The equation had changed. Not because of the 14 warships sitting at the perimeter, though they had mattered in their quiet way as the unsolved variable that kept the network guessing, as the message that only one alien in the chamber had understood. Not because of the intelligence files or the courier drones or the maintenance corridor meeting. Those were tools. The equation had changed because a subdirector with a 40-year grievance had trusted his own judgment over a machine that had never been wrong, and the room had followed. Course, Admiral, Vasek repeated. Morrow turned from the display. Somewhere in the Kesari network, TESEC 4 was already modeling their departure, their trajectory, their probable next engagement. It would catalog every variable it had missed, every communication it hadn't intercepted, every human protocol too old for its sensors. It would build a better model. It always did. But models, Morrow knew, could only predict what they could quantify. And the variable that had broken this one, the willingness to be wrong on your own terms rather than right on someone else's, lived in a place no sensor array could reach, no processing node could map, no optimization engine could solve. Home, she said. The Hearthstone's engines lit, all 12 nacelles cycling to full power, their glow shifting from amber to white as the drive field engaged. 14 ships turned as one, their weathered hulls catching the amber light of the threshold's orbital halo, their formation tight, their course laid in. Behind them, the convergence chamber sat empty, the dais still rotating slowly in the silence, the Kesari's avatar still hovering, still calculating, still searching for the variable it had missed. It would search for a long time,